Hello everyone and welcome to this review for Shaman for the upcoming Rise of the Shadows expansion. We're going to be reviewing cards on a 1 to 5 scale. If you want to find out more about the scale, you can check in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube, or you can check back on the other VODs as well. The neutrals one, we kind of went over it in more detail. Basically, 1 is trash and unplayable cards, 5 are your meta-defining cards, and the other numbers mean something in between. So there's also the consideration that with Specialist, we're going to consider some cards as tech cards, which means we might not even give them a rating on the 1 to 5 scale. First up here for Shaman, we have Swamp Queen Hagatha, the villain of the Shaman class. We're going to see the second Hagatha in a standard, much like we're going to see with Dr. Boom coming up in Warrior. Swamp Queen Hagatha is a 7-mana 5/5 legendary minion with Battle Cry. Add a 5/5 horror to your hand. Teach it 2 Shaman spells. So the way this works is you basically discover the first spell. I think the first spell can be a targeted spell, and the second one option it doesn't offer you any targeted options. So when you play the 5/5 for 5, which is the horror, you will be able to target the first spell, and the second one won't be targeted. So that's pretty important. You know, we're not talking about a horror that played spells at random, otherwise, or with random targets, then it might be pretty bad. Swamp Queen Hagatha, obviously, you anti-tempo yourself in order to play Hagatha, but you do get to gain back the tempo later. And there are a couple cards in the Shaman that we'll see, like Mutate, where you can make up for the loss of value on Hagatha immediately by evolving her with Mutate, or possibly even the lackey that helps you, the faceless lackey that evolves your minions. So I think Swamp Queen Hagatha is a pretty interesting card. I'm going to really look forward to seeing seeing it see play and actually getting to play with it. I think that the design is really cool and gets people excited, which is an important thing to consider. It's not just about power level of cards and how good they are in tournament constructed formats. It's also about how fun and enjoyable the cards are. And I think Swamp Queen Hagatha really ticks the boxes there. So well done, Blizzard, for the design of Swamp Queen Hagatha. I think when we talk about the actual power of the card for rating purposes, I'm not sure this is a card you want to play in a lot of decks. I think if we have like some aggro Shaman decks, this could be a sideboard option for those decks. Otherwise, if we have some kind of mid-range value Shaman decks, this is good in those. Or if we have control Shaman decks, this is good in those. So I think I'm going to give Swamp Queen Hagatha a 3. I don't think it's a card that pushes you into any of those archetypes enough to get the 4 rating. But I do think that it can be quite solid in quite a few of those archetypes. I think that those archetypes also have other reasons to play them. And I think Swamp Queen Hagatha is overall pretty good, and I'm a big fan. We also have to remember that control Shaman still has Hagatha herself, the hero card, and that's fairly important, as not many classes are going to have hero cards anymore. Okay, so next up we have Scargill. Scargill is a 4-mana 4/4 Murloc. It's a legendary, and it reads, your Murlocs cost 1. So Murloc Shaman is something they dropped on us kind of in the final reveal stream in a way. A lot of these Murlocs dropping then. I think Scargill has a very, very powerful effect. The problem with Scargill is that Murloc decks and most Murlocs are quite low cost. So you're not it's not like you're playing some 8-mana Murloc with Scargill, right? It's not like you're getting an insane tempo play, really. You're going to be playing a bunch of small minions with Scargill if you save it and wait to play it. Now, if it sticks to the board, it's insane after that to just constantly refill the board. But it's not going to be all that easy to stick Scargill, especially now as we're losing like Gentle Megasaurs, the key here, that we're not going to be able to adapt our Murlocs to keep them healthy. I think one of the best combos with this is obviously Cold Light Seer. So you can play Scargill and Cold Light Seer on 5, and that will buff your whole board if you've got Murlocs on the board, and it'll give you a 4/6 Scargill, which is now something that's going to be a lot more difficult for your opponent to kill. So I think overall I really like Scargill. I don't think Scargill is the card that pushes the Murloc archetype, but I think it is a card that is fairly powerful in the deck, so I'm going to give Scargill a 3. But pretty much it's only the Murloc decks, obviously, where you're going to see Scargill. Next up, we have Muckmorpher. Muckmorpher is a 5 and a 4/4 epic minion with Battle Cry. Transform into a 4/4 copy of a different minion in your deck. So, very much along the lines of the kind of bonds or recruit kind of mechanics. I'm not really sure where Shaman is going to go with some kind of big Shaman deck like that. Another interesting thing is that if you have Muckmorpher, 2 Muckmorphers in your deck and 1 Malygos, and you have the other Muckmorpher and the Malygos still in your deck when you play the first one, it will always hit the Malygos because it says it's a copy of a different minion in your deck. So that means your Muckmorpher can never copy a Muckmorpher. And that's fairly relevant for those kind of decks. It improves the consistency quite a lot. Also, I do love that we've got like the little Mucklings in the background that we saw on like Muck Hunter. That card. I think that's really cool. I think you could build a deck where there's enough targets for Muckmorpher that Muckmorpher is pretty powerful. And because Muckmorpher is an epic, we can play 2 of it. So unlike Barnes, where you're it's a lot less likely that you draw it on turn 4 because you only have 1 copy. Muckmorpher, we can have 2. So I think Muckmorpher is a card that really pushes that archetype. I'm not sure that the big Shaman archetype is really worth it. I'm not sure that any of these big archetypes are good enough right now, as there doesn't seem to be the really big payoffs that we would want. I mean, like for this, you want either some really good death rattles or something that with a very powerful effect, like your Sarahs and Lich Kings, and Lich King is rotating out, and that's a fairly big issue for cards like Muckmorpher, honestly. So I think Muckmorpher, I'm gonna give it a 4 because I think it's pretty good in that deck. We'll see. There's another upcoming 8-mana elemental that even that is a good target for Muckmorpher in a lot of scenarios. So I'm not really sure that the deck is going to be good, but I think Muckmorpher is the card that pushes the big Shaman deck. Next up, we have Witch's Brew. Witch's Brew is a 4-mana, 2-cost epic spell. Reads Restore 4 health, repeatable this turn. So I think this works exactly like Echo for every case except Kragwa. I don't think that this gives you... It doesn't put like another copy in your hand, so I don't think it counts as casting multiple copies with Kragwa. If it does, then obviously you can generate a ridiculous amount of healing over multiple turns with Kragwa like that. But I'm not really sure that does that. I think this is a pretty nice and versatile card for control Shaman decks. It just doesn't do anything to affect the board or to stem the bleeding. All it does is patch up your existing wounds and doesn't stop you from getting any more. And that's always a problem. Cards that only restore health are generally not particularly effective, especially if they're outside of Priest, where most classes don't have much synergy for restoring health. We've got a bit in Druid now, but other than that, it's pretty much just been Priest and cards like Northshire Cleric, where we actually have synergy for restoring health. So I think Witch's Brew is a 3. I think it's a playable card in some control archetypes. I'd almost even call it a 2 because I'm not sure it's even going to be worth playing in most of the control archetypes. I mean, we can compare it to something like Healing Rain. It looks a lot worse. Healing Rain is rotating out, though, I'm pretty sure. So you kind of have to keep that in mind. I think, unless we can copy this a lot of times with Kragwa and get insane healing over the game, but then all you're really doing is attritioning out the aggro decks like that. That doesn't help you win against the other control or even the mid-range decks. So I think that that's something we need to consider with Witch's Brew. So I'm going to give it a 3. I think it's a good 3, though. The card itself is reasonable. I'm just not sure it's going to see that much play in any real decks. Next, we have Hagatha's Scheme. Hagatha's Scheme is a 5-mana rare spell. Deal 1 damage to all minions. Upgrades each turn. So this is the first scheme they revealed. and got me pretty excited for the rest of the schemes. I must say, after this, I was kind of disappointed by most of the other schemes, to be honest. I think 5 mana to deal 2 damage is possible in Shaman, where the AoE is not that great. If we think about it, for Lightning Storm, we pay 3 mana and 2 Overload to deal 2 to 3 damage. A lot of the times, that is going to be 2 damage to the targets where you really need it, unless you are very good at high rolling your Lightning Storms. So I think that Hagatha's scheme at 2 damage is passable. At 3 damage, it's pretty good. And at 4 damage, it starts becoming really insane. And I don't think it's too unreasonable to consider that in a control deck, we're going to be holding our AoE for a little bit until we get a good turn to use the AoE. So I think that this scheme really synergizes well with the idea of holding card into cards. You hold onto the card, the better your AoE gets and the bigger boards you can clear. We could see some really insane Hagathas in like value control mirrors or Hagatha schemes where like we can deal 20 damage with one Hagatha scheme, which is, I think, importantly why it doesn't go face. I think Hagatha's scheme is a very good card. I think it might be enough to push control Shaman as an archetype. We also have to remember that we've still got Storm Chaser in Standard, the 4 mana 3/4 elemental that draws you a 5 cost or more spell. So that can draw you your Hagatha's scheme, which means that you can have it in your hand from turn 4, which means it's at least a 2 damage spell. Even on the first turn you could play it. And I think that's fairly relevant as well. I think Storm Chaser definitely helps make Hagatha's scheme more reliable for you to get the most out of it. So I think Hagatha's scheme is going to be a 4 from me. I think it's one of the cards that really pushes that kind of archetype for Shaman. I'm not sure that's going to be the best archetype for Shaman. I think a lot of these other Murloc cards we're going to see coming up are pretty good. But I think that in that archetype, Hagatha's scheme is very powerful. Next up, we have Underbelly Angler. Underbelly Angler is a 2 mana 2/3 Murloc. After you play a Murloc, add a random Murloc to your hand. So, Murloc decks, traditionally tempo-y, board flood, aggro type decks, right? And Underbelly Angler kind of ticks all the boxes there. It's a 2 mana 2/3 with the Murloc tag. That seems reasonable enough in most scenarios. And then as a benefit, if you're playing other Murlocs when this is on the board, you just get extra value for the rest of the game, which is important because a lot of Murloc decks tend to run out of cards. We've got a couple, like there's some crazy synergies with Scargill, and you can like spam out a bunch of Murlocs late into the game. And obviously that's pretty good, but I'm not sure that like Underbelly Angler is not going to push the deck, push you into building the Murloc deck. It's not like a win condition to draw a bunch of Murlocs or to get a bunch of Murlocs in your hand, but it is a very powerful effect and something that definitely gives the Murloc deck more reliability, more juice, which is important as Murlocs really like juice. So I think overall I'm going to give Underbelly Angler a 3. I think it's a very powerful 3 though in that deck. And I think overall the whole Murloc package is probably at least a 4. So Underbelly Angler kind of pushes closer to a 4 in that sense because he's a key part of that Murloc package. Next up we have Sludge Slurper. Sludge Slurper is a 1 mana 2/1 Murloc. It's rare and it has Battle Cry. Add a lackey to your hand, overload 1. So 1 mana 2/1, that's kind of what you expect. You get a card in your hand. That card is better than your average 1-drop. So in many ways, this is comparable to something like Firefly, where you're getting 2 1-drops. The difference being is Firefly wasn't necessarily all that great in Shaman, and you would rather have the health most of the time over the extra attack in Shaman in particular, because of the like buffs and stuff that you can use to buff up those minions, and they're more likely to stick if they have the extra health. But lackeys are also a lot better than flame elementals that you got from the Firefly. So I think Sludge Slurper is probably just a 4. I think it's a very strong card in the Murloc deck. It gives you another good turn 1 play for Murlocs, and that's important. I think the Overload 1, people are a little bit ignoring this too much. I think that Overload is very detrimental to tempo-based decks unless they can make good use of it, like obviously Overload Shaman used to do back in the day. But there's no real payoff for overloading other than Lickem. And I think Lickem is the big card that makes Sludge Slurper as good as it is, because it activates Lickem. And if you like have Lickem on the board, if you have Lickem equipped, the 2-mana 1/3 weapon that gets +2 attack if you have an overloaded crystal, then you can play Sludge Slurper to just fill it in anytime you have that free mana, and that gives you the rest of your mana to do what you want with, and it activates Lickem for 2 turns, because it activates it for that turn, the turn you're overloading, for the next turn when you actually have that overloaded crystal locked. So I think overall that kind of leaves Sludge Slurper as a 4, and seems like a fairly solid card. I know a lot of people are getting very hyped for it, but I think in a lot of scenarios that overload is going to be more of a detriment than a bonus, like it would be with Lickem. Okay, now we have Walking Fountain. Walking Fountain is an 8-mana 4/8 common elemental with Lifesteal, Rush, and Wind Fury. This card seems really good. This is the card where I was referring to that is insane of something like Muck Morpher, where if you play Muck Morpher and copy this, you probably can kill maybe 2 minions at the most, but playing 5 mana and gaining that health there is really powerful. Like a Muck Morpher copy of Walking Fountain is not that much weaker than an actual Walking Fountain, and I think that's very important to realize. Now, Walking Fountain also has some good synergy if you can just play it on 8, even if you don't have something to rush into. It's sticking on the board. It has a lot of threat. I mean, we're seeing Corpse Taker rotate out, unfortunately, for Walking Fountain. Otherwise, this would have been insane in Corpse Taker even decks in particular, or even just any kind of deck with Corpse Taker. So I think Walking Fountain is a 3. I think the card is pretty good. It's not really pushing the archetypes, but it's a good enough payoff for us to maybe start considering that big Shaman archetype. And I think even in some control Shaman decks, we might look at Walking Fountain as a better way to heal than Witch's Brew. So I think we can consider Walking Fountain as a 3. Next up, we have Soul of the Murloc. Soul of the Murloc is a 2-mana common spell that reads, give your minions Death Rattle, summon a 1/1 Murloc. So Soul of the Forest, essentially, but at half the cost and half the reward. But the difference is you're getting Murlocs instead of Treants. Obviously, Druid has synergy for Treants, and now Shaman has synergy for Murlocs. So I would argue, though, at the lower cost, Soul of the Murloc is probably a bit better than Soul of the Forest. We're not in a world where we have Defile running around, so we don't have to worry about that cleaning up all the Murlocs either. I think Soul of the Murloc is probably the card that really pushes an aggressive Zoo Murloc deck. I think this actually might be the first card that I'm going to rate a 5, because I think that it is meta-defining in that a lot of other decks have to really consider this when building their decks, and how they're going to actually deal with wide boards in order to not get blown out by Soul of the Murloc into buffs like Murloc War Leader, or even just the good old classic Bloodlust. So I think Soul of the Murloc is going to be a 5. It's going to be a very powerful card that really sets the tone of the best Shaman deck going forward, which, as long as that deck has enough other support, and I think it does just have enough other support, then we're going to see a very, very powerful deck for Shaman. Next up, we have Mutate. Mutate is a 0-mana spell. We spoke about this a bit already. It's a 0-mana common spell. Transform a friendly minion into a random one that costs 1 more. So, this is exactly like Evolve, but for a single minion only. At 0 mana, that seems about fair, especially based on how we've seen the Evolve effects costed on other minions. On the Lackey, it's basically costed at roughly 0 mana as well. And on the Faceless, I forgot what it's, the Shaman card that was like a 4 mana 4/5 that evolved something, it was basically costed at 0 there too. So overall, I think Mutate is a reasonable effect. The problem is I don't really want to put this in most of my decks. Like, I don't really see the payoff with only upgrading a single minion. All you're doing is basically taking a minion you play and transforming it into a random minion that costs 1 more. That's not like as powerful as, Doppelgangster Evolve was, or any of the kind of board-wide evolve effects. And we don't have any other support for evolve. So I think at best mutate is going to be a 2. But I think it's honestly probably kind of close to being a 0, unless we can find some really weird synergy for it. Sorry, not a 0, a 1. Unless we can find some really weird synergy for it that I'm not really thinking of. So that's all the Shaman cards. I think the Token Murloc Shaman looks promising. I think there could be some kind of mid-rangey Shaman deck that can tech into a much more control Shaman deck. Big Shaman is a consideration with Macamorpha as well. So I think that's a consideration. But I think Soul of the Murloc is still the standout card for me in Shaman, and the one card that really pushes the deck to being, or the class to being very much focused around that archetype. And that being the archetype you'll expect most of the time you queue into Shaman on ladder. So overall, I think Shaman looks pretty good. You can feel free to share your comments on the stream if you're watching there, dib_gaming on Twitch, or you can contact me on Twitter at dib_gaming, or you can like and subscribe or comment on YouTube. You can also share. All of that helps a lot on YouTube as well. So thanks a lot to everyone that does do that, and we'll see you in the next video for Warlock.